Hey everybody, Dajia Hao. This is the China-Hollywood Greenlight podcast, episode number 11.
And rolling sound, quiet.
Here we go. Ready.
Speed.
Speeding. 120, take 7.
And action.
This is Karen McCann, the host of the China-Hollywood Greenlight podcast, a podcast about creating and distributing content for both Hollywood and China. If you like the show, please go to iTunes, subscribe, and leave a rating so other people can find the podcast. The more we work together, the more opportunities will be out there for everyone. Any links mentioned in the podcast can be found in the show notes, as well as a full transcript at chinahollywoodgreenlight.com/podcast, and look for this episode, which is number 11. Before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to start out with a motivational quote to encourage our listeners to continue on their path to achieving their own green light. And today's quote comes from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And he said, "What you get by achieving your goals is not as important as what you become by achieving your goals." Today's guest is Aynne Kokas, author of Hollywood Made in China. Here is the interview. Today's guest is Aynne Kokas, who is the author of Hollywood Made in China. She is also a fellow at the think tank Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. Kokas' writing and commentary appears regularly in media outlets including the BBC, CNBC, NPR's Marketplace, The Washington Post, and Wired. So, Aynne, welcome to the show, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on, Karen. I'm really excited.
Great. Well, I've told the audience just a little bit about you, but tell us more about yourself personally and about your business.
Well, I started being interested in the connections between China and Hollywood right after I graduated from college. During college, I actually lived in the Beijing Film Studio Work Unit. So when the China Film Group was still a state-owned entity, I actually lived in the studio dorms, and I became really interested in the changes in the industry. So at that point, Peter Lorre had just produced the Zhang Yang directed film Shower or Shizao.
I love that.
Yeah, and my roommate at the time was the granddaughter of one of the old actors in Shower who had lived in the Beijing film studio for many years. So a lot of her old friends and classmates came to our house, and so I got to know people in the Chinese film community that way. And then I went back to the U.S. and I was working as a management consultant for a while, which was not as fun as hanging out with people in the Chinese film industry. So I decided to go back and study for a year in the directing department at the Beijing Film Academy. So I made a couple of extremely bad short films in Chinese. And I was a finalist for a VJ position on MTV China. And I started working in production and market entry analysis for the Huayi brothers at that point. And so that was really interesting. But a lot of my friends and colleagues were there, and they were like, "Why are you an American in China doing this stuff? You should be in Los Angeles." And I was like, "That is actually a great point." So then I went to UCLA, and I decided to study about Chinese filmmaking. So I got a PhD scholarship there. And while I was at UCLA, I had the chance to work under Janet Yang for a couple of years. And then started going back and forth doing research about the Chinese film industry, attending the Shanghai International Film Festival, the Beijing Film Festival, as well as forums that were emerging in Los Angeles at the time. So that kind of formed the basis of a lot of the research for my book, Hollywood Made in China, which came out this past year. And that brings us to where we are today. And now my work focuses on the media policy issues between China and the U.S. So the kind of concerns that U.S. Congress has about Chinese investment and influence in the entertainment industry, because that emerged as a major concern while I was doing a lot of my industry research.
That sort of leads me to my first question. Can you tell us what are 2 or 3, and now I know there's no such thing as a typical day, but what are 2 or 3 main tasks you do on a, quote, typical day?
Well, it depends on the year. So this year, I'm a research fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. So a lot of my time right now is spent writing and doing research. So reading industry reports, reading analyses of, reading earnings reports from publicly traded media companies. I also attend some congressional hearings here, as well as different think tank events. When I'm doing research, fortunately, because I'm a professor, I have the chance to go and spend 2 or 3 months at a time in China, attending film festivals, meeting with people, doing interviews with government officials and with producers, and reconnecting with my colleagues and friends from when I was working more actively in the production process. And then when I'm at UVA, then I spend time teaching students. So teaching the future leaders of the China-Hollywood scene about what it means to be a co-production and Chinese government media regulations and the kind of long-term benefits and risks we have from these collaborations.
So when you're at these film festivals and you're talking to government, it's about regulations. What are you talking to the producers about?
Well, I mean, I'm always curious to find out what types of projects people are making, also what types of trade-offs they're willing to make in terms of the types of projects that get funded, the types of things that they're even willing to pitch to government officials. Now, a lot of times I can't publish stuff about that, and I don't. So if I'm interviewing someone and they say that something is off the record or something that they would prefer not to publish about, then I'm always very careful to not include that. But it's helpful for me as a researcher to kind of understand the larger strategic challenges that producers are facing. Typically, the stuff that I can eventually put on the record is when a deal goes really sour, and then people are willing to talk about it, usually unfavorably about their partners. So I also have to be careful with that as well.
So these are American and Chinese producers that you're interviewing?
Yeah. And actually, I started off doing more interviews with Chinese producers because that was actually where I started first working in the film industry. So those are the people that I've known longer.
To expand on that sort of leads me into my second question. But just a little background. You were a consultant at Warner Brothers Digital, and yes, as you mentioned, you studied at the Beijing Film Academy. Mm-hmm. So you've interviewed top American and Chinese executives for your book, Hollywood Made in China. In these findings, how did the American film and TV executives find their Chinese business partners, and how do you suggest the listeners find a Chinese business partner?
Well, this is really interesting because it was radically different from when I started doing my PhD field work in 2007 to when the book came out in 2017. In 2007, there were a lot of industry forums that basically because I was a foreigner, I would be let into the forums because they were trying to increase international representation. By the time I did my final field work in 2016, there were it was much, much more carefully policed who could enter the forums and who couldn't. And that was really reflective of the ways in which people found partnerships as well. In 2007, for example, the State Administration of Press, Publication, Radio, Film, and Television was really advocating and supporting independent film partnerships. So it really was an interesting window for independent filmmakers to try to enter the market and find relatively high-level partnerships with people like the China Film Group or the Shanghai Film Group. As time progressed and the Chinese film industry began to grow rapidly, those partnerships began to dry up. So it was much more difficult for an independent filmmaker to get a high-level film partnership. Now, there are exceptions to that. People like Janet Yang, who have been in the industry for a very long time, have made successful independent film collaborations with major Chinese film groups. But more recently, we've seen that it's been major studios that have been able to successfully ink those deals. So I would say at this particular juncture, it's really important to find people, first of all, if at all possible, to partner up with a major player because of the increased leverage that the Chinese film market has. Alternatively, I would say that a way that actually I've gotten a lot of my interviews has been through alumni connections. So that was really an interesting angle in terms of being able to speak with people and kind of establishing more forthright relationships. So, for example, people who are, so I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, so I was able to, meet people and kind of establish more earnest connections through the University of Virginia Alumni Network, or as an alum of UCLA, the UCLA Alumni Network, or University of Michigan. These are alumni connections are really important in China, and that actually translates relatively well. If you have no background and no connections, and you're trying to establish some kind of commonality with a potential partner, I would say that's a relatively safe route to go if you're just starting out. And of course, long-term friendships are great too. But I'm hesitant to say just rely on your long-term friendships with Chinese friends, because presumably that's why people are listening to this podcast.
Of course. Okay, well, that's a good tip. You need to dig into those alumni networks. That leads to my next question. Maybe people, obviously, you're the exception. You went to the Beijing Film Academy and you've got these great academic connections. For people who perhaps don't have those connections, that's kind of an obstacle.
Yeah.
Which goes to my next question, which is, what obstacle did you encounter in a past project and how did you overcome it and what did you learn?
Well, there were many obstacles on the path to completing this book, but I would say that an obstacle that may be similar to a lot of the listeners is really finding people that I could rely on, and that's something. I mean, I'm from the Midwest. I'm very much a Midwesterner. I'm very earnest. I, believe people when they speak to me. And actually, one of the kind of funny incidences in terms of this idea of reliability was I learned about the word when I was studying Chinese. There's this word "gai tian," and it basically means at some point. and I kept getting people, both when I was trying to work in directing and production, and also when I was trying to do research, where someone would say like, "Oh, Gai Tian will do this thing," or you can interview me, and I'd be like, "Okay, well, great. I'll follow up with you next week, and we can set up a date." And then the next week would come, and it'd be like, "Oh, Gai Tian," and I was like, "Oh, wait a second." So at a certain point, I asked my best friend who's from the Beijing Film Academy. I was like, "So, this Gai Tian, I just keep trying to pin them down." And she was like, "Well, that's because that means never. I mean, you just aren't smart enough to realize that when they're saying Gai Tian, it means do not bother me about this again."
Okay, so what did you do?
Hopefully that.
How did you overcome that?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of different ways. Sometimes you just try to do it. Sometimes you just try to approach someone else. But other ways are, look at. There have been times when I've turned that around where I found out that I actually was friends with someone else that person knew, and then was able to request that friend to ask that person, and then eventually they might, give in or change their mind. Not always, but occasionally that worked better. But at a minimum, it's good to know that is actually a stop sign rather than merely a delay tactic.
Oh, okay. Good. You definitely need guanxi and persistence.
Yes.
Now that's a problem that you dealt with. If you could magically solve two current problems, what would they be?
I would say, first of all, the transparency of capital movement, I think, is a huge issue. So understanding how much money it's possible to get out of China, and making sure and then increasing that number, I think is a huge issue for people who are trying to work with Chinese partners in the U.S. And then I think also transparency about regulations for foreign content. We've seen these kind of really rapid transformations in distribution standards for foreign content happening really quickly. So in last summer, having the foreign dramas on ACFUN and Bilibili being removed kind of almost overnight, I think gave a lot of people pause about what the future of foreign content in China is, among other things. But that's one that comes to mind immediately. We're kind of dealing with this quota renegotiation right now as well, which also poses some long-term strategic risks for people who want to bring foreign content into China. So I would say that those are two major question marks that we'll see what happens in 2018 and 2019.
And what about your own personal slate? If you have two problems you'd like to solve, what would they be?
I guess what I would really love would be for to find a better way for researchers to work with producers and directors and people who are involved in this space. Because I think that I had a really, really wonderful collaboration with Warner Brothers, in which I learned a lot from them, and hopefully they learned a fair amount from me. But it's exciting to be able to have those conversations where as a researcher, you can take a step back and look at the kind of bigger picture, and then you hear about the kind of issues that people are having on the ground as well. And I feel like at a very minimum, I find it to be really enlightening and enriching to my work. And I hope that sometimes when I'm speaking with other people, they're able to take a longer view of things. And one kind of example of that was, in my work, I look at, kind of 5 and 10 and 15 and 20-year time trajectories. And one of the things that was really interesting when I was working with Warner Brothers was the importance of quarterly increments and quarterly earnings, and the ways in which a lot of media and tech companies make decisions based upon their quarterly earnings, when especially in places like China, that actually can really lead you down a bad path, because the Chinese government and the Chinese media industries are actually looking at things at a very minimum in the increments of 5-year plans. But actually, today I was just reading a report on informatization of the Chinese economy. This is the sort of thing I do during the day. But it was looking at from 2006 to 2020 how to digitize more parts of the Chinese economy. So when you're dealing with an economy and with a media system that is really oriented toward a much longer term, looking at things only from the duration of one project or quarterly earnings can be very detrimental.
But originally, you were saying you'd like to fix the process of researchers, or the way the researchers meet with directors or producers. What did that?
I guess I'd like to increase the channels for communication between the two parties in order to basically avoid. So what I try to do in my work, and I tried to do it somewhat in my first book, and I'm trying to do it even more in my second book, which is looking at digital platforms and digital distribution platforms and consumer-facing platforms, and U.S. companies and their engagement in China, is really trying to write things that are useful for an academic audience, but that also have an important message to share for people who are really critically engaged in the practice of media collaboration.
Okay. Now, this next question is a bit theoretical. If you could do your career over again, what would you do differently?
Oh, man, that's such a good question. Oh, I know. Okay. I would have totally studied computer science and more math. No, and I would probably want to do the same thing, but with a much more kind of quantitatively oriented focus. Because what we're seeing is, a lot of studios are using AI and data sets that they gather about users in order to produce films. And I think that the intersection of technology and entertainment is really, really fascinating. And actually, this is something that I'm working on right now. So I've actually started kind of taking computer science classes, and I was working with a cybersecurity lab when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Rice. Because I think it's a really important direction for the future of the industry, and I'm excited to see how that goes and how it develops.
Well, that sort of leads into my next question. What are you trying to accomplish this year? Is there another book coming up?
Yes, there is. There's a book called Border Patrol on the Digital Frontier, in which I'm looking at consumer platforms, including Netflix and iOS and Facebook and Alipay, and looking at how Chinese platforms are trying to enter the U.S. market, U.S. platforms are trying to enter the Chinese market, and what that ultimately means about, about the borders of our digital world. And do those exist, and how are they being created artificially by governments, and how are they being kind of pushed by corporations?
Oh, that sounds great.
Thanks.
I look forward to reading that.
Oh, well, I look forward to writing it.
Now, this next question is a little bit kind of a trick question.
Okay.
What question did I not ask you that I should have?
So one thing that I think is really important to ask all researchers is why is your work important, and what can it do for people in industry and in policymaking? And that's something that I always try to ask myself, and that is something that I hope that we're able to kind of continue this conversation, and I hope to ask my colleagues that as well, because this is such a rapidly changing industry, and it's important both for people on the ground who are making changes day to day, and for people who are able to take a long view to collaborate, because ultimately the U.S.-China trade relationship in media is something that's going to be developing and changing over the next 30 to 40 to 50 years. And let me tell you, the Chinese government has thought through the 50-year plan for this.
Okay, right. Well, thank you for that question. And thank you for giving us your answer to that question. That's good to know. Now, this last question is, what advice would you give to those aspiring to tap into the Chinese market?
Be humble.
Oh, well, that's good, because you always hear about the ugly American who goes in and thinks, I'm just going to go in and turn on the money tap and let the cash flow.
Let me tell you, I started creating a list of projects that were Sino-US collaborations when I was working on my dissertation. And so I'd read the trades, and there'd be these lists of this project and this slate that was being created. And I would say less than, probably a quarter of them ultimately were in the list of completed projects by the time I finished. And those are the projects that were completed and that had been announced. I mean, obviously there are other ones that are discussed and are never announced in the trades. And then even on those projects that were completed, the discussions that I had with people who were involved with some of the projects suggested that there were some really, really big challenges that a lot of people faced. And a lot of it has to do with being open to listening and kind of working with your partners, and also being very humble about what you know, just so that you don't necessarily get cheated as well.
Yeah, well, it helps to have a good Chinese business partner. And obviously, you've got to maybe tap into that alumni network, like you mentioned earlier, use those connections.
Yeah.
Now, in conclusion, would you like to share any social media details or perhaps some website links?
Yeah, absolutely. So please follow me on Twitter. It's @ShotInShanghai. And my website for my book, as well as additional media that I've commented on and written, is www.aynnekokas.com.
Great. Anne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You have some really great information, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that the audience has too.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've had a great time chatting with you.
Okay, thanks, Anne. And we'll see you at the premiere.
Bye. Take care.
We've got 3 key points, as always. Number 1, Anne mentioned she wished she studied more computer science and math. As she said, there's a huge intersection between technology and entertainment. More and more studios are using AI and data sets to gather information about the audience, which will influence which films they make. this could be a growth area, or at the very least, executives need to be tech savvy or have this kind of skill set on their team. Number two, regarding long-term thinking, it seems American corporations typically tend to be a little short-sighted compared to their Asian counterparts, who look at maybe 5 to 10 to 15, and in China's case, 50-year plans. So for studios, this may be a wake-up call. As Anne said, when you're dealing with an economy and with the media system that is really oriented towards a much longer term, looking at things only for the duration of one project or, quarterly earnings can be detrimental. And number three, you need to be humble. American and Chinese ways of doing business is very different. We all know that. In America, we tend to want to jump into business first, do things the American way, and that doesn't work in China. Now, for takeaways, one takeaway, it's kind of obvious, but it's easy to forget. Use your network, your alumni network. It's maybe you haven't utilized it. I know I'm guilty of this myself. So go to that reunion or mixer and start growing your network. And now for the episodic part of this podcast, this is where I update you on my progress with my projects and getting my own green light. And I have some news, 3 points. One, I heard from a producer who has a slate deal who is keen on one of my scripts. Number two, I sent a couple of scripts to 2 Chinese stars. And number three, I contacted a manager who is known for being keen on Asian martial arts projects. So wish me luck. And then lastly, I'm also looking for more guests for the podcast. So spread the word. And if you'd like to join the podcast or would like to recommend someone, please send me an email at podcast@China-Hollywood Greenlight.com. So thank you for listening to my podcast. To show your support, please go to iTunes, subscribe, and leave a rating so other people can find the podcast. The more we work together, the more opportunities will be out there for everyone. And I'll see you at the premiere. Bye. 一会儿见.